Good afternoon and welcome to this session of the Hindu Lit for Life 2016. First off, I'd like to congratulate all of you, thank all of you for passing up the opportunity to sit in air-conditioned comfort and listen to what I'm sure will be a very erotic discussion on the Kama Sutra. Thank you for being here to listen to us speaking about the whole process of addiction, centered around a remarkable book written by Diya Sethi. I'm going to ask Vidya to introduce Diya to you. Vidya needs no introduction to anybody in Madras. She is also an addict. She's addicted to fitness, which is probably the best addiction to have. Vidya.
Thank you, Vijay. First, I'd like to request all of you to join us in welcoming this wonderful young girl to our city, and also for sharing this beautiful book with us, this wonderful journey that she has experienced. The greatest war that any human being can fight is the war with oneself. In 2002, Diya Sethi went from being an anorexic bulimic to becoming a chef. This is her story. Diya Sethi was born in New York City into what may be described as a cocoon, adored and nurtured by two doting parents, and sheltered and protected by the umbrella of diplomatic life. She had it all: effortlessly intelligent, attractive, and expertly trained in the art of conversation in the drawing rooms and at the dining tables of the rich and famous, the powerful and the privileged. She traveled the globe, winning admirers and accolades for being just who she was, tailor-made and fine-tuned for different people on different occasions. But she was never who she was. She was an impersonator, on the run from herself. She was on the run from a child who had stumbled out of her cocoon and into a world where she had been cruelly rejected, ridiculed, hurt, and humiliated. A world in which she found solace in addiction. This was an addiction known as anorexia bulimia. The Addict, A Life Recovered, is a memoir on her struggle with anorexia bulimia while she traveled the globe as the daughter of a diplomat, and her unconventional recovery and that challenges the tenets of conventional rehabilitation. Diya Sethi currently lives and works in New Delhi in the capacity of a freelance consultant chef. She also writes on gastronomy for online food forums. Honest and gut-wrenching, yet ultimately heartwarming, this tale of fortitude and perseverance cannot but move and inspire us. Diya?
Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Vidya, for an introduction full of pomp and glory, but I am afraid with all humility I must temper that a little bit. There is no heroism in this story. I don't think there is any heroism in finding recovery from self-inflicted ruin. I stand here behind a book I've written for what I hope is a noble purpose, and that is to help people find real freedom from addiction. If I failed to do that, then I've merely sensationalized my own story, and that was not my intention. A little over a year ago, is this still working? Yeah. My editor hesitantly informed me that mine was a story that fell into a category known as memoirs of misery, and I really cringed. But allow me to say that this isn't a memoir of misery. I stand before you today as one of the lucky ones, and I do not look back at my life with any regret. There is, however, apology, and that apology is to the little girl born on August 26, 1974, named Diya, a child full of an innocence that I tampered with. I let her believe she wasn't good enough. I let her learn the terrible language of I am not good enough, a language that slowly but surgically destroys a person. The Addict, A Life Recovered is not only about the journey to recovery from addiction, it is also an incisive look into the living of life within the imprisoning boundaries of a strong identity. An identity we often allow to become a label, which shackles us, limits our potential, and the quality of our lives. I spent 13 years trying to unshackle myself, not only from addiction, but also from the image and impression I had of myself. Eventually I did, and I signed an invisible contract with myself from which I not only found freedom from addiction, but also from the prison of my identity. As Victor Hugo once wrote, I lost my mind and came to my senses. Okay, thank you. The Addict, A Life Recovered, has tried to provide an alternative to the tenets of conventional rehabilitation. It has tried also to break certain conventions, taught to, if not imposed, on many of us, life conventions. In essence, The Addict, A Life Recovered is the story of the search for and discovery of freedom. In April last year, 2015, when the book was released, I brought nearly 4 years to a close of writing it. And today I would like to conclude by presenting you my first introduction to a brand new life 16 years ago, an introduction I have since made to myself every day of my life. It couldn't be better summarized than it has been in a poem by Derek Walcott. And I quote, the time will come when with elation you will greet yourself arriving at your own door, in your own mirror, and each will smile at the other's welcome and say, sit here, eat. You will love again the stranger who was yourself. Give wine, give bread, give back your heart to itself to the stranger who has loved you all your life, who you ignored for another. Take down the love letters from the bookshelves, the photographs, the desperate notes. Peel your own image from the mirror. Sit, feast on your life. Thank you very much.
Diya, that was really lovely to hear. A very brief introduction to what Diya has written about. Her basic premise is that the only author of an addict's recovery is the addict herself. Her basic premise also is that existing treatment processes, interventions, rehabilitation processes are far too restrictive and tend to take away from the individual's sense of self. And she's chronicled how she's managed to deal with all of that. And my first question to Diya is going to be, what do you think needs to be the approach to a person with addiction?
It might be quite controversial to say this, although I think increasingly there is a movement in this direction that deals with chronic physical ailments. For me, the approach that needs to be used for addiction is that of tapping into the subconscious of an individual and extracting hidden, buried emotions, particularly those of pain, fear, guilt, and shame. I do not believe that addiction in itself is a sickness. I think it is a consequence of a lot of pain and an anesthetic for pain. So to be able to effectively deal with it, I think one needs to extract the origin of it, which is often very deeply buried and therefore a rather arduous process. And conventional rehabilitation, which really is the 12-step program for recovery, fails to do this. I speak as someone who has been through it. It is a Band-Aid. It helps people, yes, come into recovery. The motivation behind that recovery a lot of the time is fear, fear of relapse. And by virtue of fear, if any of you are familiar with the law of attraction, if you're frightened of something, you're going to attract that outcome inevitably. So it tends to provoke the cycle of relapse, regret, reform, recovery, and so it goes on. Is that sufficiently answered your question?
Well, it's begun to answer the question.
Okay.
Vidya, what is your reaction?
I think what I have to say is I read her book cover to cover maybe in 2 days. It's almost like she has torn open her soul to write this book. I was deeply traumatized reading it, and I thought to myself, here is a young girl who has grown up in a privileged kind of an atmosphere. Was her story to do with the fact that her family moved around in so many places to so many areas that she had to re-establish herself and be rejected in so many places? A lot of us, especially from our city, grew up here. We live in very, very protected, almost like a cocoon in our lives. So we grew up sheltered. So could that be part of it? It was a traumatic story to read, and I admire you, Diya, for having come out of it and be brave enough to tell this story. I think that's the positive of this.
Well, I actually, I feel traumatized when I meet people who've read the book, because the reactions can be quite extreme, very emotionally profound. As far as how could this happen to me when I was so protected and privileged, I think the reaction was probably disproportionate to what I actually went through. The addictive personality, or somebody prone to the addictive personality, is generally a very oversensitive person. That might be in the world in which we live today, or has been for many years, where it's survival of the fittest. It's almost a handicap to be oversensitive. Rootless, yes. It is the toughest thing for a child is to be different. You want to be the same, and it's a very cruel contradiction, because as an adult, we all thrive on distinguishing ourselves and being different. But as a child, it's very rough being different and not being the same, whether it's color, creed, whatever it is. So I went through various forms of difference. The most harsh form of it being obviously color discrimination when I lived in Southern Africa, which I've written about. The reaction was one of self-loathing. And it was, as I mentioned, just not feeling good enough. And so I tried to anesthetize that feeling, and I also tried to look for ways in which to be good enough. You know, a lot of success in life, some of the most successful success is built on the back of insecurity. I wasn't one of those people. I didn't, fight with it. I became a sick person. It could have had the other effect on me. I could have become determined to go out into the world and prove myself and become damn good at something. But I wallowed in it. So that's why I find often there is a kind of a jingoism that sets in with people like me who've been through something like this and come out on top, is that we feel like beating our own chests and feeling very proud of it. But we damaged our own lives to begin with, and we didn't have the right to do that. A life, if you look at it as a gift, you're not the creator of it, then you don't really you have a duty to nourish it, not to damage it and to kill it from such a young age.
For the benefit of those who haven't read the book, who aren't aware of what Diya went through, she went through, I hesitate to call it an illness anymore, ever since I met Diya yesterday, because she's quite averse to thinking of it as something which took over her, but rather as something lacking in her to allow such a development to take place. Be that as it may, it's considered a disorder where it's an eating disorder, where people, for a variety of reasons, either don't eat at all, over-exercise, that's the anorexic end of the spectrum, or bulimic, where they overeat, they binge eat, then they purge, they vomit, so that they can get whatever they've eaten out of the system. Now, you might wonder, is this an addiction? In fact, eating disorders sit very squarely on the interface between addiction, what's called body image disturbances, Because many people with anorexia feel that they are too fat, even when they are absolutely emaciated. Also sits on the borderline between of psychosomatic disorders, and it is an eating disorder. So there are all four of these elements which are in operation when it comes to anorexia bulimia. To me, the most extraordinary part, and this is what I'd like Diya to speak a little about, is that not only has she recovered from it, she works with food. Food was her problem. Today, food is her business. Diya, can you tell us something about that?
Well, in the book, I think I've titled that chapter by quoting The Art of War, which is, keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. So food was, in many ways, an enemy. And in fact, I'm fortunate enough to have one of my old friends from cooking school in London, who just happened to be in Chennai, in the crowd today, and I think who saw me struggle a lot. I'm not sure she was aware of it then, but she did realize it in hindsight. It was a struggle, and I wanted to up and run, but it dismantled the regimented way in which I'd come into recovery. Recovery from an eating disorder, as far as conventional rehabilitation is concerned, they tell you don't ever fall into the trap of feeling hungry or full. Essentially, don't feel, because it's too dangerous to feel. If you feel, you look for an anesthetic for those feelings. So avoid feeling, and follow a very regimented diet in which you mustn't eat certain things like sugar and flour and anything that has can set off a compulsive tendency as far as an appetite is concerned. I didn't have that luxury. You don't have that luxury when you go into a cooking school like the Cordon Bleu or CIA. You have to face, taste, deal with food 8-10 hours a day. And I tried to get away for a while in cooking school by producing food without tasting it until I got caught out because it was unseasoned and it was foul. And if you do end up reading the book, you read rather tragic chapter on what I went through, trying to con my way through cooking school. But eventually it's the greatest thing as far as recovery is concerned that I did for myself. It really gave me freedom. I stopped identifying myself as an addict, number one, an addict in recovery, number two, an addict at all. I was just back to being a normal human being. And I'd been told in my rehab center in England that I never would be, because that's what they tell you. Once an addict, always an addict. You can only hope to be in recovery for the rest of your life, but you've got to fear that little person on your shoulder, the addict, who can come back and bite you if you ever drop your guard. So you live with that. I refused to accept it. And I went out and I stumbled and I fell and I stumbled and I fell and I stumbled and fell until I couldn't even get up again. But I found my way through that. And I found my way through that largely using Eastern practices in India. I found myself back in India, hospitalized for internal bleeding, etc., etc. Eventually, that led me to the doorstep of Ayurveda, yoga, where I learned about the dynamics between the mind and the body. And that helped a lot. This is prior, obviously, to my then challenging myself even further and going off to cooking school. So that's my story about food.
I think what you say about mind and body is absolutely right, because whatever affects your mind translates into the body, whether it's a positive or the negative. And I myself have been treated by Vijay Nagaswami in the past, not in the recent past, for a period of time when there was an emotional turmoil, a terrible emotional turmoil, and the mind affects the body. And I was not eating and lost 6-7 kilos, and thanks to 6-7 months with Dr. Nagaswami here, he was able to pull you through it. But it has a terrible effect on your body. And reading your story, you realize what you have gone through, because it was beyond your control. It somehow felt that it had overtaken you, the the anorexia, bulimia had overtaken you completely, and it was in you were in its control. That was my feeling reading the book.
Yeah, you create that monster. It gives you that feeling of control over your own life when you feel that you've lost any other form or a grip on your life. But that friend that you have eventually becomes the monster that sort of haunts you and starts slowly killing you. Any kind of addiction, whether it be alcohol, drugs, relationships, if you please, they can all become very dangerous and very detrimental in their compulsive form.
Now, unfortunately, there aren't too many good treatment facilities for people going through anorexia, bulimia. In the first place, awareness about it itself is so limited. They just consider too thin or overweight. They're not really looked upon as people who have something happening inside their mind that needs some help with. And whatever treatment centers are available are basically rehab kind of processes. And if you read the book, and I would suggest that you do, Diya is pretty excoriating about rehab processes as they exist, simply because they attempt to classify, type you and put you within, some kind of straitjacket, which actually takes a much longer time recovering from than the problem itself. So what kind of treatments do you think we need in our country?
I think we have them. I've written about going from a prison of addiction into a prison of recovery, because recovery, as far as conventional rehabilitation is, just keeps you in a vice also, of being frightened all the time, of relapsing into your addiction. We have them at our doorstep. I mean, if one is to follow the line of reasoning that I've adopted, which is that it is about dealing with the dynamic of mind-body, we have it all at our doorstep in India. Increasingly now being used. There's a very interesting book being written by a doctor called The Divided Mind, which talks about that dynamic and the incidence of chronic ailments, whether it be back, digestive, etc., etc. And what a place in New York is doing now, a place called the Rusk Institute, through a certain type of very aggressive psychotherapy. You've got to sign give your consent and be prepared for that type of psychotherapy. They are tapping into the subconscious of the individual and extracting and helping people expunge certain emotions which are the cause for these chronic ailments. If you view addiction in the same way, then you will be able to work backwards from that, and you will realize that you've got to go into the burial ground of the individual, which is the emotional burial ground, which is the subconscious. And I think we have a means of doing that already in India. I think the dialogue needs to be established over here, because it does take a certain amount of Q&A with a patient, and you can't take things at face value, so to speak. You can ask a person, from what I've understood of this therapy. In fact, it's what I would really like to. The first step was to write the book, and the second to go off and study this. You can ask someone, well, what are you feeling? And they understand the first stage of the subconscious, which is they'll say, I'm scared. But there are many, many layers of the subconscious, and in order to get to the bottom, that fear a lot of the time is hiding guilt or shame or various other emotions that are not easy for the mind to accept. The mind finds it easier to induce physical illness. It finds it easier to cope with physical illness than it does with any kind of emotional pain or disability. So I think the incidence of addiction is the same kind of consequence as any other chronic ailment. Or at least if we start treating it that way, I think we might have a greater success rate.
Okay. Right. Now I'm just going to move this slightly to Vidya and Vidya's addictions. Yeah.
That's to, I think, sport and fitness. That's the kind of addiction. But that's of course aside. But talking about Diya's story, I think the three things that she had in her favor. One is the realization at some point of time that she needed to do something about it. That's point one. And point two is that she had professional help, whether it helped her at that time in different ways. She had different types of help to pull her through this. Also, she had an incredibly supportive family. That, I think, is your backbone for any person who's going through any kind of trauma, whether it is anorexia, bulimia, whether it's drug addictions, whether it's alcoholism or any emotional trauma, you need those three elements. Starting point to know that you need to do something for yourself.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I have to say that I had those crutches while I was sick, or the crutch that was my family, what I've written, what I've called in the book, my mother in particular, who's in the crowd, and I'd rather not look at her when I say this, but like a life support machine. Also, the same reason I eventually decided to fight it was just the realization that, you know, I was hurting her child. So I eventually divided myself into two people, me and I. Me as the person at my core, who my mother, for example, it's quite interesting, this can help. If you become the observer and the observed, and you realize that as the observer, and your character that has been formed by various experiences, and if you look at yourself that way, you realize what your rights and, you know, what right you have and what you don't have. I was damaging the life of a kid that my mother had given birth to, and that sudden realization, as twisted as it might sound, you know, induced enough guilt and shame in that moment for me to say, well, hey, you know, I don't have the right to do this. And so that was when I put up probably the real fight or struggle to come out of I won't say anorexia necessarily, I'd been through drugs, alcohol, come out of this process of trying to bury myself, my pain, my feelings, and to reinvent or to create, or to start living again.
It is truly an extraordinary story, and before I throw this open to questions from the audience, I'd like to say that, you know, just leave you with a word of caution. Whenever I speak about addiction, or speak about dependence, speak about the need to reclaim oneself, most people end up thinking, I'm not an addict, you know. It's somebody else who's an addict, you know. Or they think it's cool to be an addict, you know. Now the thing is, we need to understand that addiction is not just to substances, not just to alcohol, not just to chemicals. The final common pathway for all addictions is the same. There are certain receptors in the brain which keep getting filled up, keep demanding more, you know. But what we choose, the addiction that we choose, really depends upon the kind of lives we lead. Remember, you can get addicted, not just to food. I think the word that Diya used was anesthetize. We all experience pain. We all want to numb that pain. We choose our anesthesia, our anesthetic. For some of us, it's chemicals. For some of us, it's shopping. For some of us, it's relationships. For some of us, it's sex. So we become love addicts. We become sex addicts. We can become addicted to watching television, to surfing the internet, to, you know, playing video games. We can become addicted to pretty much anything, because when we are troubled, we feel the need for some calm. And when you get into some kind of activity which makes you feel calm, whatever that activity is, the tendency to start overdoing it and eventually getting addicted to it is very, very possible. In other words, what I'd like all of you to remember is that Diya got away. You know. She got away through sheer dint of extraordinarily hard work, an extraordinary spirit that demanded even more of herself than of her environment. But not all of us might. We are all, in that sense, addicts waiting to happen. Let's not make it happen. It's easier to prevent it than deal with it. Now I think we'll be happy to take...
Sorry, before Vijay goes to the questions, I just have to say that one of the things that came through the book which I read was her holding on to a prayer which repeats itself, the Serenity Prayer, which she kind of, every time she went through a down thing, she would say the prayer to herself, and somehow that kind of was like an anchor almost. That's what I felt, and I love that. Maybe you can read out the prayer or just say it for us. It's commonly known and it's nothing new, but it meant a lot to her.
Well, as I've written, it's a virtual anthem of the 12-step program for recovery, but it's quite inspiring. It's very simple. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Simple.
And with that, we'd be very happy to take questions. Please identify yourself and identify the person you'd like to ask the question to.
I drink lots of coffee. Is it anesthetizing myself by my anxiety and depression?
Who would you like to answer that?
You.
You know, you read the papers, every day they say different things about coffee. Some days they say that it's bad. Now they say 5 cups of coffee a day is good, but more than that is bad. But the bottom line is this: if you find that it's coming in the way of your life, in any other way, whether it's your health, whether it's your mental well-being, whatever it is, you need to break a pattern, break a habit, not just of coffee. It could be even of something like lying, say. So if you want to stop a pattern or a habit, then you need to make that conscious effort.
I think, as Dr. Nagaswami said, the addiction could be anything. And as he had mentioned earlier, I was definitely very addicted to exercise. It's not, I mean, I didn't think of it as a bad thing or a fault, but the fact is that you do a session in the morning, you've done your day, you've had your meals, and by evening, 5 o'clock, you're like, okay, I can do another session. That is addiction. And I did realize...
I'll interrupt there. Wait, firstly, the dictionary definition, or at least the institutional definition of addiction, is mind-altering substances and behaviors. Now, exercise is a very healthy pastime if it is adding to your level of fitness, stamina, etc. If it becomes injurious, I mean, this, you don't need a doctor. The moment it starts becoming injurious, I did come out of an eating disorder initially and exercise myself to virtual death until I started developing stress fractures, etc. in my bones. It became injurious. I think in the case of Vidya, whose svelte frame certainly shows that she exercises very well, but if it becomes injurious, then it's a problem. If your coffee habit makes you stutter, makes you an unpleasant person to be with, you certainly don't look like an unpleasant person to be with, well then it's become a problem. But until then, an extreme is not an addiction. It's also wonderful to be passionate, and I don't think one should temper passion out of a fear of becoming compulsive or an addict. Passion must be enjoyed, lived, experienced, exhibited. I love coffee. I mean, I just can't sleep at night, so I have to stop at a certain point, and so I drink it throughout the day.
That's where, if you're not able to sleep at night and still you insist on drinking your coffee, then you have a problem.
Yeah.
So that's basically the way to look at it.
Also, as Diya said, I think there's a point in which it goes beyond what you should be doing when you start getting your injuries and when you start becoming addicted to the endorphins and the high that comes through even exercise. I mean, even that can give you a high, and that is what you get addicted to, because you want that feel good, that wellness feeling that comes from exercise.
Any other questions?
I think there's someone
Yes,
in back.
ma'am.
Diya, this question is for you. You talked about how a lot of your feelings had to do with self-loathing and your struggle to anesthetize. How did you deal with self-loathing, and how is it now?
Well, I dealt with self-loathing by eventually, I became an addict. I became compulsive. I wanted to feel good about myself. I wanted to feel in control of some aspect of my life. So I started playing with my body, trying to control my body, trying to deny myself sustenance. And it felt good. So that was anorexia. It spiraled out of control. It started controlling me rather than my being able to control me, my life, my body. How do I deal with self-loathing now? I still do things that make me very unhappy with myself. I still give myself cause for guilt and shame, especially very recently, in fact. I have to face it, and I have to find a way of forgiving myself for it. One of the important parts of the 12-step program is to try and make amends, particularly if it involves someone else. I think it's very important to make amends. Saying I'm sorry is often, becomes a habit in itself. You keep trying to find your way out by looking for forgiveness from somebody else, but it doesn't really work. You've got to try and address it within yourself and forgive yourself at your core. It's a daily exercise, really, in many ways. At the end of the book, I've written that the most important dialogue that I've ever had, and I continue to have, and I think if it was visible, I might be locked up in a mental asylum, but it's really a dialogue between me and I. One has, an internal dialogue within oneself, because it's very easy to go and look for absolution outside. You run to your mother, you run to your boyfriend, you run to your brother, and they'll tell you it's okay, because they genuinely want you to feel that it's okay. But you need to find that within yourself. Trying to bury it or trying to make excuses for it, both are triggers for addictive or compulsive behavior. So I think it involves an internal dialogue, which is tough, easier to go to somebody else, but there is no easy way.
What if this self-loathing arises not from the mistakes that you made, but more about how you think people look at you, or how you think people treat you, or something like that?
My mother once said something very important to me, that if I react to what people think of me or how I look, I'm reacting. I'm giving consent to allow them to make me feel that way. It is with my consent. Don't give your consent. That's the simple version of a rather complex answer. But I hope that's something that you can understand or relate to.
Thank you so much.
Also, I think it's also, at the end of the day, there are people who are going to want to help you, your family surrounding you, but it's you yourself. You have to want to do this. You need to go on with your life. You need to move to the next stage, and that comes from within yourself. And I think you had the understanding and the courage to see that and come through this to where you are today.
Yeah, as I've written, my family, or my mother in particular, she gave me survival, but I had to give myself life. No one else can do that for you. No one.
Right, we have time for 2 more questions. Yes, the lady here.
I'm actually a mother of a recovering anorexic. I say anorexic because she doesn't admit to us to being bulimic. It's very difficult as a mother, to know what is right to say, what you can say, what you can't say. I'm always treading on eggshells. Apparently I keep saying, or I used to, what's wrong with you? This is very, it's really, really very difficult for me. So I just want to know, Diya, what are these, triggers that could upset you, and say from your mother or from your loved ones, I know it's a tough one.
No, it's not a tough one. I would ask you to read the book. I think you'll find some answers there. I would tell you today, don't tutor your own reflexes. Don't fall into the trap. Addicts, we drag our families into our world. My family had to be treated in my rehab center. They needed to be extracted from the world of addiction themselves, because you become policeman, preacher, guard, and you get insidiously dragged into that world, and you don't know what's right, what's wrong, what to say, what not to say. You start feeling responsible, you start feeling guilty. You've got to be true to yourself. You can just love the person like you naturally would. You can pick up the pieces, but there's very little else that you can do. But for God's sakes, don't beat yourself up about what you say. Virtually everything can be a trigger. As I said to you earlier, the addict personality is a very oversensitive personality. So anything and everything is a trigger. You have to protect yourself. And if you're going to be strong for your daughter, then you really have, as I say, you have to protect yourself and you have to nourish yourself. But you are not the cause. You are not the cause. And you are not the solution either.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm afraid we'll have to stop with that. I think that's a wonderful note to stop on. We've run out of time. I'm sorry we can't take the other questions, but Diya is available. You can we? We can take one question. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Don't you think time is a very important factor during the whole process of addiction? You know, by the time you find your own way, there's a sense of an ending that, okay, I'm in the middle of nowhere. Where should I go? I've ruined up my education. I broke up with my family. I have nowhere to go. And there's an end. There's a sense that the time is over. That there's time for everything. There's time for education. There's time for building up yourself. And then when later you realize that, okay, I have to overcome this addiction, you are left with nothing. So how should we, tackle that when time is a burden on you?
Okay, I did address this at some point. That is a convention of life that we are taught, that there are specific times. What is preventing you from going back to university at 40? Nothing. What is preventing you from trying to learn how to dance when you're 60? I'm not going to reveal Vidya's age, but you'd be damn surprised if you knew how you wouldn't even guess. Okay, or running a marathon when you're no. We are made to believe there is a time and a place for everything, and this is one of the conventions that I have sought to disassemble in the book. You can always reinvent yourself. You can always recreate your own life. There is no beginning and end until the day where you can't, you just where the light is extinguished, and that's not within your control anyway.
Thank you so much.
And we've been told by the organizers that it's a wrap. Thank you very much.
And this is the book